Britain spent 50 years building cars with features that would get a factory shut down today. There is a handle you turned by hand that broke so many wrists the injury ended up with its own medical name. There is a wheel nut that was shaped to slice into anything it touched. There is a suspension layout that could tip a small family saloon onto its roof on a dry road at 30 miles an hour. I have got 10 of them here, and the last one did not just hurt the driver, because it poisoned entire cities for 80 years. We are starting with the one that broke bones. Look at the front bumper of a Morris Minor or an early Land Rover, and you will find a small hole in the middle of it. That hole took a starting handle, and you used it when the battery was flat, which in a British car in February was most mornings. You pushed the handle in until it engaged with the crankshaft. You tucked your thumb alongside your fingers rather than wrapping it round the bar, and then you heaved upwards. The reason you kept your thumb out of the way is that the engine could fire early and spin the handle backwards faster than your arm could let go. The handle came round and hit your wrist at the speed of the engine. It happened so regularly in the early motoring years that doctors gave the resulting break in the wrist bone its own name, and they called it the chauffeur's fracture, because chauffeurs were the people cranking engines all day long. Britain kept fitting starting handles into the 1970s, long after every other market had quietly given up on them. No manufacturer on earth would now sell you a car with a manual device on the front that can turn your own arm into a lever against a running engine. The next one was waiting for your face. Open the door of a Rover P5 or a Riley or a Wolseley from the 1950s, and the first thing that hits you is the walnut. British manufacturers built their entire class identity around a solid timber dashboard, and they polished it until it shone. Sitting on top of that timber, you would usually find a row of chrome switches with sharp edges, a chrome ashtray, a metal rear view mirror on a rigid stalk, and a set of instrument bezels with a lip on them. None of that was padded, because nobody had thought of the idea yet. In a frontal impact at 30 miles an hour, an unbelted passenger travels forward and arrives at that dashboard head first. Wood does not deform in any useful way, and it splinters instead. Casualty departments through the 1950s and 1960s saw a specific pattern of facial injuries that came almost entirely from car interiors. The Americans made padded dashboards and recessed switchgear a legal requirement at the end of the 1960s, and modern rules go much further by demanding that any surface a head can reach must absorb energy in a measured way. The walnut survived, and it survives today in a Bentley, but there is now a layer of engineering underneath it doing the job the wood never did. This next one was pointed straight at your chest. Underneath the steering wheel of almost every British car built before the late 1960s, there was a single solid steel tube running in a straight line from the wheel to the steering box, and the steering box was bolted to the front of the car. When the front of the car stopped suddenly, that box moved backwards, and the tube had nowhere to go except through the cabin. Engineers of the period understood exactly what this meant, and accident investigators described the column as a spear aimed at the driver. The driver came forward into the wheel at the same moment the column came back into the driver, and the two forces met in the middle of the chest. The fix arrived from General Motors in 1967 and became compulsory in America a year later, and it involved building the column in sections that collapse into each other and adding a mesh section that crushes on impact. British manufacturers took most of the following decade to catch up across their ranges. Every car sold anywhere in the world today has a collapsible column, and a rigid one would fail type approval before it reached the second test. The next one meant that a single leaking pipe took away everything. Press the brake pedal in a Mini, a Morris Minor, or an early Triumph, and you were pushing fluid down one hydraulic circuit that fed all four wheels. There was one master cylinder, one set of pipes, and no backup of any kind. British cars ran steel brake pipes along the underside of the floor, and they lived their whole lives in salt and water thrown up from the road. When one of those pipes corroded through and split, the fluid went out of the hole rather than into the brakes. The pedal went to the floor with nothing behind it, and it did that on the first firm application, which usually meant it did it in an emergency rather than on the driveway. Your remaining option was the handbrake, which acted on the rear wheels through cables and would lock them long before it slowed you down. The answer is a dual circuit system, where the master cylinder feeds two separate circuits so that one failure leaves you with half your braking rather than none of it. America made it law in 1968. Britain arrived at it gradually across the 1970s. There is now no jurisdiction anywhere that would let you sell a car with a single hydraulic circuit. The next one could put you in a hedge without any mechanical failure at all. The Triumph Herald and the Vitesse carried their rear wheels on swing axles, which means each half shaft pivoted only at the differential in the center of the car. The wheel therefore swung through an arc rather than moving straight up and down, and the angle of the tire against the road changed every time the suspension moved. That behavior turns dangerous under cornering load. As the car leans and the outer wheel is pushed upwards, the axle can pass through its arc and tuck the bottom of the wheel underneath the car, and the tire ends up standing on its outer edge. Grip disappears in an instant, the back of the car steps out, and the same geometry then lifts that corner of the car and encourages it to roll. Drivers describe the Vitesse as being perfectly civilized right up until the moment it was not. Triumph eventually reworked the rear end with a lower pivot and a proper linkage, and the cars became genuinely pleasant to drive. Modern type approval includes a rollover and stability assessment, and a production car that changes its own camber that violently underload would not get through it. This next one was aimed at everybody outside the car. Fit wire wheels to a Jaguar E-Type, an Austin Healey, or an MGB, and each one was held on by a single large central nut with 2 or 3 wings sticking out of it, and you tightened it by hitting the wings with a copper hammer. They looked magnificent, and mechanics loved them, because you could change a wheel in about 40 seconds. The problem is that those wings sat at roughly hip height and stuck out beyond the widest point of the bodywork, and they were spinning. Anybody the car brushed past in traffic, on a pavement, or in a car park was being cut by a rotating blade rather than being knocked by a bumper. British sports cars were sold in enormous numbers into American cities, and American regulators worked out what the wings were doing at the end of the 1960s and outlawed anything that protruded from a wheel like that. Manufacturers replaced them with a smooth octagonal nut that needs a spanner. Every set of eared spinners you see at a show today is fitted to a car that is exempt because of its age, and the modern rules on external projections would not allow a single one of them onto a new vehicle. The next one has the same problem and a much more famous badge. Rolls-Royce put the Spirit of Ecstasy on the front of the radiator in 1911. Jaguar put a leaping cat there, and Bentley used a winged bee. Every one of them was a solid metal figure mounted rigidly on the highest and most forward point of the car, and every one of them was directly in line with the pelvis and the head of an adult pedestrian. Rolls-Royce reached the answer first and did it well, and in 1976 they built a mascot that sits on a spring-loaded mechanism which drops the whole figure down into the shell of the radiator the moment anything strikes it. The modern version retracts on impact and can also be lowered into the car electrically when it is parked. Jaguar simply deleted the leaper from the bonnet in the 2000s and moved the cat onto the badge. Europe brought in pedestrian protection requirements that measure exactly what happens when a head or a leg meets the front of a car, and a fixed ornament standing proud of the bonnet fails on the first strike. The mascot survived on the Rolls-Royce only because the company engineered a way for it to get out of the way. The next one was how a whole generation of British children traveled. Climb into the back of a Land Rover Series or an early Defender, and you were not sitting facing the front. You were sitting on a thin bench along the side of the load bay, facing inwards across the vehicle, with your back against the panel and your feet braced on the floor. On many of them, there were no seat belts at all, and the bench sat directly above the rear axle. Facing sideways means that everything a frontal impact does to your body happens across your spine rather than along it, and a belt cannot restrain you properly in that position because there is nothing in front of you to be held against. The vehicle also came with a windscreen that folded flat onto the bonnet on a pair of hinges, which left the occupants with nothing between their faces and the road ahead. European rules on seating position and restraints closed off sideways-facing seats in new passenger vehicles, and the same tightening of crash and pedestrian legislation is a large part of why the original Defender finally went out of production in 2016. This next one is the reason mechanics of that era are still dying. Herbert Froude started making brake linings in a workshop in Chapel in Le Frith in Derbyshire in 1897, and the company he founded, Ferodo, supplied most of the British motor industry for the best part of a century. The material that made those linings work was asbestos, because it survives enormous heat.
It does not burn, and it wears at a predictable rate. The danger was not in normal driving. The danger arrived every time somebody serviced the car. Drum brakes fill up with fine dust as the linings wear, and the standard practice in every garage in the country was to pull the drum off and blow the dust out with an airline. That put a cloud of asbestos fibers straight into the air of the workshop, and the mechanic breathed it in, and the fibers stayed in the lungs permanently. Clutch plates carried the same material and were treated the same way. Britain banned the import and use of asbestos completely in 1999, and mesothelioma from motor trade exposure is still killing people who were apprentices in the 1970s. There is no country on earth where you could now specify an asbestos friction material for a road car, and the last one went far beyond the people who bought the cars. Every British engine built before the middle of the 1980s was designed around leaded petrol. Tetraethyl lead was added to fuel because it raised the octane rating cheaply and let engineers run higher compression, and it also cushioned the valve seats in the cylinder head, which meant that manufacturers could machine those seats out of ordinary cast iron rather than hardened steel. The lead was therefore designed into the engine rather than merely poured into the tank. All of that lead came out of the exhaust pipe as fine particles, and it settled on the roads, the verges, the playgrounds, and the front gardens of every town in the country. Lead damages the developing brain at concentrations far below the level that makes an adult ill, and the research through the 1970s and 1980s kept finding the same relationship between traffic density, blood lead levels in children, and measured cognitive development. Studies of soil beside major British roads still turn up elevated lead today. Britain held on longer than most of its neighbors and finally banned leaded petrol for road cars on the 1st of January in the year 2000. Owners of older engines now run their cars on unleaded with hardened valve seats fitted or an additive in the tank, and the industry adapted within a couple of years once it had to.
That is the pattern across all 10 of these. Britain built cars the way it had always built them, kept doing it long after the evidence had arrived, and then changed only when a regulator somewhere else forced the issue. Tell me in the comments which one of these you actually lived with, because a lot of you owned these cars when they were simply the cars everybody drove. Subscribe as well, because there are far more of these stories than most people realize.